Okay. Mr. Bauer is 64 years old, having been born on March 27th, 1947. My name is Vincent Corwin, and I'll be the interviewer. John, Mr. Bauer is a family friend. Mr. Bauer, could you state for the recording what war and branch of service you served in?
I served in the Navy. Saw combat action during the Vietnam War.
What was your rank?
During my time in Vietnam, I was lieutenant junior grade. I retired from the Naval Air Reserve as lieutenant commander.
And where did you serve during your time in Vietnam?
I served with Fighter Squadron 31, VF-31. We were a part of Carrier Air Wing 3, which was stationed aboard the USS Saratoga, an aircraft carrier. That our operating area was in the Tonkin Gulf, predominantly on what they call Yankee Station, which is off of North Vietnam. Periodically, we would fly missions from what they call Dixie Station, which was off of South Vietnam.
Okay, so we're going to start with the early days of your service. Could you tell us whether you were drafted or not?
No, I volunteered. I had, for a good part of my life, particularly my high school years and through college, had wanted to be a naval officer. I took 2 years of Army ROTC in college. ROTC was mandatory at that time for all male students. The only ROTC available at the college I attended was Army, so I took 2 years of Army ROTC, but did not opt to go into the advanced program leading to a commission in the Army. Instead, I became aware of an officer program through the Navy, and my junior year in college was accepted into that program.
Was the fact that you're in the ROTC program the only reason why you wanted to go into the military?
No, I would have entered the military had there not been a requirement for military service, i.e. the draft at that time. I didn't necessarily feel that I would want to make it a career, although I was certainly open to the idea, but I did want to, I did very much want to serve in the military, and very much wanted to serve as a naval officer.
Were there any specific reasons why that kind of made you want to go into the military, and more specifically into the Navy?
As far as the military in general, I think it was the feeling of giving something back to the country. Participating in something, having grown up, been raised as a citizen of the United States and taken advantage of all the benefits and freedoms inherent in citizenship. I felt an obligation to contribute something back to the country, and I felt that military service would be an appropriate way for me to do that. As far as the Navy itself is concerned, I guess my initial interest in the Navy was, well, I was more familiar with the Navy, I think, because my father had served in the Navy during World War II in the South Pacific. And having heard him tell various stories about his Navy life and experiences, I was more familiar with it, and I think that instilled in me an initial attraction to the Navy. And as I learned more, read more about the Navy and the history of the Navy and its place in world affairs, and also the critical role that the Navy, any Navy, plays with regard to a maritime nation such as the United States, lent itself to a greater attraction, I think, to the Navy. Plus, I thought the uniforms were cool.
You talked a little bit about your father. Could you talk a little bit more about your family dynamics? For example, things like your parents' occupations,
Sure.
Number and gender of siblings.
My family roots were in southern Missouri. Both my mother and father having grown up in a small town in southern Missouri, Thayer, Missouri. My dad was one of 4 children. My mom was one of 2 children. My family was basically a railroad family. Both my grandfathers worked for the railroad. My dad was his occupation was that of a dispatcher for the railroad. One of my grandfathers was a engineer, train engineer, and my other grandfather also worked for the railroad, and various uncles and distant relatives. I myself worked for the railroad 3 of my summers in college. At that time, the late 40s through the 50s, working for the railroad was tantamount to being in the service. So we did, in terms of moving around, so we did a lot of moving around. I did most of my growing up in northern Mississippi. And then the family moved back to Missouri, to Springfield, late in my high school years. Both my mom and dad graduated from the same high school. Neither attended college. My mom did not work outside the home. There were 5 of us children, 3 boys, 2 girls. I'm the second oldest child. Not long after my dad graduated from high school, I guess 2 years or so, the United States entered World War II, and my dad was at some point during that time frame, I think he was either drafted or he enlisted in the Navy just prior to being drafted, but served as a radar man aboard a attack troop transport in the South Pacific. He saw action at naval battles of Okinawa and also, I believe, in the Lake T Gulf area. I guess I would have to say that I experienced a normal childhood, inherent of representative of that time frame, the late 40s, 50s, and early 60s. Normal, what would be considered normal family life, I guess. My older brother attended and graduated from Mississippi State. I probably would have attended Mississippi State myself, except that we were transferred. My dad was transferred back to Missouri, and I attended Missouri State University in Springfield, Missouri. My sister, oldest sister, younger than me, but she did not graduate from college, but Worked as a flight attendant for American Airlines for about 13 years, I guess. And my younger sister graduated from the University of Missouri and with a degree in education, and later earned a master's degree. And my younger brother did not attend college as well.
You mentioned that your father served in the military. Were there any other family members that also served in the military?
My older brother did, simply because at that point military service was required. And immediately upon graduating from Mississippi State, he was hired by Firestone Tire and Rubber Company and lived in Memphis. He completed his military service through the Naval Air Reserve, whereby he enlisted, was on active duty for 6 months, and then on reserve status for the next 6 years. Outside of myself, the only children in the family that experienced military service.
So now we're going to transition back to military. And so could you talk about how you were feeling when you departed for a training camp?
My particular program was the Reserve Officer Candidate Program. I enlisted in the Naval Reserve in March of 1968. That was during my junior year in college, second semester. That summer, the summer between my junior and senior year, I attended 8 weeks of officer candidate school. At that time, the Navy's Officer Candidate School was in Newport, Rhode Island, but that summer, due to construction at Newport, they were unable to accommodate us, so we were sent to the Naval Academy at Annapolis. And since the brigade of midshipmen were all away at their summer deployments or whatever, they had plenty of room to accommodate us. Then I, upon completion of that, went back to college to finish my college, my senior year. And then in the fall of 1969, went to Newport for the second half of Officer Candidate School. I suppose leaving for Annapolis that first summer, mixture of, I guess, a mixture of excitement, mixture of anticipation. I had wanted to get into an officer program for quite some time, and here was the chance to do it. And some feeling of fear or foreboding, I guess, of the unknown, not knowing what to expect exactly, this sort of thing. But overall, I think an atmosphere of anticipation, excitement.
When you actually got to training, what was your training like? What did you do?
Well, it was a mixture of physical training and academic training and military indoctrination. You're taking college students and basically turning them into naval officers in a period of about 18 weeks. Half of it, of course, was our first summer. The first part of it, I guess, was a bit of a shock treatment sort of thing. Just the normal process of turning in your civilian clothes and wearing uniforms, getting your hair cut, the all of the elements of the initial disciplinary process of snapping you into a military routine, that sort of thing. I guess I was fortunate, very fortunate, in that this is something that I had wanted to do, that's something that I had wanted to experience, as opposed to a number of my classmates there who chose that program primarily because they didn't want to go into the Army and they didn't want to get drafted, that sort of thing. But this is something I would have done anyway. So I think my experience in that regard was a bit better. There were, I know some of my fellow candidates there were rather disgruntled at having to be there. It's not something they would have done had they had a choice. Whatever.
Did you have any specialized training after the officer candidate school?
Yes, after, well, of course, this would have been my second session in the fall of 1969 in Newport. Of course, you submit a request for type of duty and location and this sort of thing, and we refer to it as a dream sheet, and in many ways that's probably what it was, because the Navy would put you where they wanted you. But for me, actually, I got 2 out of 3. I wanted destroyers, East Coast Operations Department. Destroyers I really had no problem getting. It's something most everyone tried to avoid. But I felt that was the best way to find out really how the Navy worked. Because a destroyer is a multitasked ship. It's not like an aircraft carrier that pretty much is there for only one thing. A destroyer is, and it's a smaller type ship. It's not a huge ship where you can get lost in terms of having to really struggle to really accomplish something as a junior officer or whatever. On a destroyer, you're thrown into the thick of it. Because you still have all the requirements of a large ship, the organization structure and everything. You just have fewer officers to get that done. So I got destroyers, East Coast, for whatever reason. I was interested mostly in East Coast. However, I was assigned to the engineering department as a damage control officer, and I was extremely upset about that. I had wanted to go into operations, but as damage control officer, I had to attend a 10-week damage control school in Philadelphia. So I was commissioned on Friday, November the whatever, and that Monday had to be in Philadelphia to start this damage control school. So that was about a 10-week course there prior to reporting to my ship.
When you got into the military life, what was it like adapting to that military life?
It wasn't really hard for me. I was not married. I was single, so made it a little easier. I could say that I adapted to it quite readily. I didn't go into it kicking and screaming. Like I said, I was one of these who had chosen this rather than had gone in grudgingly because I chose the Navy as the lesser of all evils or whatever. I had actually chosen this, so I think that helped a lot as far as adapting to the lifestyle. It just wasn't that tough for me. There were some, though, a few, who I knew that it was very challenging for.
You mentioned that you were an F-4 pilot in Vietnam. What training did you get for that as well?
I was on this destroyer for about a year, and during my time there, it occurred to me that I would want to specialize in the Navy. And by specialize, that meant going into a specialty field rather than general surface warfare. And I considered submarines, but because of the selection nature of submarines, first of all, the requirements to qualify for the nuclear submarine program. I didn't meet those qualifications at all. Would had to have taken a number of math and science courses, physics, this sort of thing, to even qualify. And at that point, that's no guarantee you're going to be accepted. And I think I just determined that I didn't really want submarines that bad. My ship was stationed at, this destroyer was stationed at Charleston, South Carolina, which was also a submarine base as well. And so I was close to these submarines and got a fairly decent insight into them, but decided I just didn't want submarines that bad. So through a process of looking more into aviation, determined that's the route I wanted to go. So I think having already been commissioned and already on active duty helped in terms of the application process and getting selected for the flight program. Having gotten selected for it, I went to Pensacola in the spring of 71, I guess. And the first, about the first 4 weeks is what they call pre-flight. You're undergoing some physical training, but it's largely academics. Well, first, the very first thing you do is you take some entrance tests. Algebra, trig, vectors, and physics, if I remember correctly. I didn't do very well on those tests. You're looking at a history major here. And so I had to go on hold for, I think, 2 weeks and take a few programmed courses there until I passed those tests. And then went right into pre-flight, which was various academic and practical experiences, this sort of thing, water survival, land survival. We had a week of training in, a few things like that. And then the rest of the flight training was just a combination of classroom and aerial type things. Your testing was fairly rigorous, but it had been that way through officer candidate school as well. I mean, it's not a sure thing that you're going to pass all of this just because you were accepted into it. So there were a lot of pressure, and it took a lot of concentration, a lot of focus, and a lot of hard work. And following training, through about the three-fourths of the way through position, through your basic training, you make selections. I was fortunate, I guess, when I went down to Pensacola in knowing what aircraft I wanted. I wanted F-4s in the fighter community. And so I worked hard to keep my grades up to the point where I could would be competitive to select F-4s. And that all worked out not as well as I thought, but after some a process of going through this whole thing, I ended up in F-4. So that worked out. And then once we finished basic training, we went through advanced training. We knew we were going into F-4s, but we weren't designated as aviators yet, so we still had our advanced training to do, and that was a lot more intensive, but geared and more focused on the F-4 itself. Then after that, we got our wings, and I went to Oceana Naval Air Station in Virginia Beach in the Fighter Squadron 101, which was what they call a replacement air group. It trained you specifically in the F-4. And then after finishing that, onto your fleet squadron.